The FW-190 was less than 200 feet behind her, and closing fast. Flight Officer Margaret Maggie Thornhill could see the gun camera housing on its nose, a dark circle that would record her final seconds. Her Spitfire Mark 9 shuddered as cannon rounds tore past the canopy, close enough that she could hear them crack through the air over the Merlin engine's roar. She had maybe 3 seconds before the next burst found metal. Every instinct, every page of the tactical manual, every word from her instructors screamed the same command: dive, gain speed, use the Spitfire's turning advantage to shake him off. Instead, she pulled the throttle back. The engine note dropped. Her airspeed began to bleed away. Behind her, the German pilot saw what looked like a mechanical failure, a stall, an amateur mistake. He closed for the kill. What he didn't see was the trap. What happened in the next 40 seconds would be studied in classified briefings for the next 30 years, and the girl they said would never survive a week over France would become the ghost that Luftwaffe pilots learned to fear. If you want more true stories of impossible moments from World War II, subscribe to the channel. It was March 1944, and the skies over Normandy belonged to whoever could take them. The Allied invasion was still weeks away, but the air campaign had already begun. Every day, squadrons crossed the channel to hit rail yards, airfields, and supply depots. Every day, the Luftwaffe rose to meet them. And every day, pilots died in fire and confusion above the French countryside. The mission that morning was supposed to be routine. Fighter sweep ahead of a bomber stream. Clear the route. Draw out the enemy. Keep them busy. Routine meant dangerous. Routine meant you might not come home. Maggie Thornhill was 23 years old, 5'4", and the only woman in her squadron. She had joined the Air Transport Auxiliary in 1941, ferrying bombers from factories to airfields, learning to fly everything from Hurricanes to Lancasters without instruments, without radios, sometimes without maps. She had logged more hours in more aircraft types than most of the men she flew with. But flying empty planes across England was not combat. When the RAF finally opened fighter postings to ATA veterans with exceptional records, she applied. They rejected her twice. She applied again. They accepted her on the condition she would wash out within a month. She reported to RAF Biggin Hill in January. The other pilots called her the librarian because she wore reading glasses and carried a notebook everywhere. They called her dead weight because she was small and didn't drink with them. They called her worse things when they thought she couldn't hear. She never responded. She just flew. And when the gunnery scores came back, her name was third in the squadron. That changed the insults, but not the doubt. Marksmanship on a range was one thing. Combat was another. They were waiting for her to freeze, to panic, to prove them right. Her flight commander, Squadron Leader Peter Carrington, was a veteran of the Battle of Britain, twice decorated, missing 2 fingers on his left hand from a cockpit fire over Dover. He didn't want her in his squadron, but he didn't sabotage her either. He assigned her to tail-end positions, low-risk patrols, far from the main action. She never complained. She studied the after-action reports instead. She read every combat debrief she could find. She noticed something the others didn't talk about. German pilots were good, very good, especially the FW-190 pilots. The Focke-Wulf 190 was faster than the Spitfire in a dive, nearly as agile and more heavily armed. In a straight-energy fight, it had the advantage. RAF doctrine said to keep speed up, stay defensive, use your turn radius to force an overshoot, then reverse onto his tail. But Maggie saw a pattern in the reports. When Spitfire pilots tried the standard defensive break, experienced German pilots didn't overshoot. They climbed, extended, and reset. They kept the initiative. They turned one defensive maneuver into 2, then 3, until the Spitfire pilot ran out of airspeed, altitude, or luck. The manual worked against average pilots. Against veterans, it was a death sentence. So she looked for what the reports didn't say. She found 3 incidents where Spitfire pilots had survived encounters with superior numbers by doing things that sounded insane. One had pulled into a near-vertical climb at full throttle, bleeding all his speed, forcing the enemy to overshoot. Another had cut his engine completely and dropped like a stone, falling below the enemy's firing solution before restarting at low altitude. The third had turned toward the enemy instead of away, forcing a head-on pass that broke the Germans' nerve. All three survived. None of them were officially commended. Their tactics were too far outside doctrine. Maggie wrote them down anyway. The briefing on March 17th was short. 8 Spitfires, 2 flights of 4, sweep from Littlehampton to Cannes and back. Expected resistance, moderate. Intelligence reported FW-190s operating from Abbeville and JG-26 active in the sector. Carrington led the first flight. Maggie was number 4 in the second flight, led by Flight Lieutenant Davies, a quiet Welshman with 6 kills. They took off at 0620 hours. The sky was pale blue, cloudless, visibility unlimited. Perfect hunting weather for both sides. They crossed the coast at 12,000 feet. The channel a gray sheet below them. The French countryside a patchwork of brown and green ahead. Radio discipline was tight. No chatter. Just position calls and altitude checks. 10 minutes inland, Davy spotted them first, for contacts, high and east, maybe 15,000 feet. Bandits. He called it in. Carrington's flight turned to engage. The second flight stayed on course, covering the flank, watching for additional threats. That's when Maggie saw the second group. 6 more contacts, lower, coming from the north, hidden in the ground haze until they climbed into the clear air. Someone had set a trap. Carrington's flight was already committed, turning into the high group. The low group was vectoring to catch them from below. Maggie keyed her radio. Red leader, 6 more bandits, Angels 8, coming up from your 4 o'clock. Davy saw them. So did Carrington. But Carrington's flight was already in the turn, already losing energy, already committed. If they reversed now, the high group would have a free shot. They had to finish the engagement or break off entirely. Carrington made the call. Red 2, take your flight and engage the low group. We'll handle these 4. Davies didn't hesitate. Red flight, hard right, we're going down. Maggie followed him into the dive. For Spitfires against 6 FW-190s. Not terrible odds, if they kept their speed and stayed together. But as they descended, she counted again. Not 6, 8. 2 more had appeared from nowhere, climbing from the deck, perfectly positioned. Someone on the ground was directing them. Someone who knew exactly what they were doing. This wasn't a chance encounter. This was an organized intercept. Davies saw it too, but too late. The 2 additional 190s turned directly into their dive, forcing Red Flight to break early or risk a head-on collision. The formation shattered. Davies broke left. His wingman followed. Red 3 broke right. Maggie was alone. 3 FW-190s turned onto her. She was trapped. She had maybe 10 seconds to think of something else. The lead 190 opened fire. Tracer round streaked past her left wing. A stream of white and red that looked deceptively slow until you realized how fast they were moving. He was ranging her, adjusting his sight picture. The next burst would connect. She could feel it. Her hand hovered over the stick, every muscle coiled, ready to brake left or right or down. The manual said to brake hard and reverse. The manual said to keep your speed up. The manual said never, ever slow down with an enemy on your tail. The manual was going to get her killed. She pulled the throttle back to 2/3 power. The Merlin engine's roar dropped to a growl. Her airspeed began to decay. 190 knots. 180. The Spitfire's nose rose slightly as drag increased. Behind her, the 190 pilot saw her speed drop and did exactly what his training told him to do. He reduced his own throttle, matched her speed, kept the range steady. He thought she was wounded. He thought her engine was failing. He thought he had all the time in the world. Maggie pulled the throttle back further. 170 knots. 160. The Spitfire was wallowing now, mushy on the controls, nose high, right on the edge of a stall. The 190 was less than 300 feet behind her, close enough that she could see the pilot's helmet through the canopy reflection. He was centering his gun sight. She had maybe 2 seconds before he fired again. She chopped the throttle to idle and hauled the stick back into her lap. The Spitfire pitched up violently, nose pointing almost straight at the sky. all forward momentum converting to vertical climb. The airspeed needle dropped through 140 knots. 130. 120. The wings began to buffet. The stall warning shuddered through the airframe. In that instant, the Spitfire was no longer flying forward. It was hanging in the air, suspended by nothing but inertia and prayer. The FW-190, flying 50 knots faster, shot past her like a train. He had no time to react. One moment, his target was directly ahead, slow and vulnerable. The next moment, she was gone, replaced by empty sky. He blasted through the space she had occupied half a second earlier, his own speed carrying him hundreds of feet beyond her position before he could process what had happened. His wingmen, watching from above and below, saw the maneuver and hesitated, confused, unsure whether to commit or extend. Maggie let the Spitfire's nose fall through the horizon. Gravity pulled her down and forward. The engine was still at idle, but she was accelerating now, trading altitude for speed. The controls came alive again. She shoved the throttle forward. The Merlin engine bellowed back to full power. She rolled inverted, pulled through, and came out in a steep dive with the lead 190 now 500 feet ahead of her and below, still traveling away, still trying to figure out where she went. She centered the gun sight and fired. The Browning machine guns hammered in sequence. 8 streams of .303 fire, converging on the 190's tail section. Strikes sparkled along the fuselage. Pieces of metal flew off the rudder. The 190 snap-rolled left, braking hard, trailing thin smoke. Maggie didn't chase. She pulled up and right, scanning for the other two. The high 190 was diving toward her, angry, committed, trying to avenge his leader's mistake. Maggie saw him coming. She had altitude now and speed, and something else. The knowledge that these pilots fought by a script. They expected certain moves. They planned around predictable responses. She had just shown them something outside the script, and for the next 30 seconds, they would be guessing. That was enough. She turned into the diving 190, a head-on approach that forced him to choose. Commit to the attack and risk a collision, or break off and reset. Most pilots broke off. It was instinct. 2 aircraft racing toward each other at a combined speed of over 600 miles per hour left no room for error. One moment of hesitation, one twitch on the stick, and you were dead. The German pilot broke first. He rolled left and dove away, abandoning the attack. Maggie didn't follow. She pulled vertical again, converting her speed into altitude, repositioning for the next threat. The low 190 was climbing toward her from below, trying to cut her off. But she had him now. She knew what he expected. She knew what the manual said she should do. She did the opposite. Instead of turning away, she rolled into a split S, inverting and pulling down into a dive that took her directly toward him. He saw her coming and opened fire early, desperate, hoping to force her to brake. She didn't. She held the dive, accelerating, closing the range to 200 feet, 150, 100. His tracer fire filled the air around her, but he was firing from below, trying to lead a target that was diving faster than he anticipated. Every round passed behind her tail. At 50 feet separation, she pulled hard left and rolled out. The 190 flashed past her right wingtip, close enough that she could see the oil streaks on its cowling. Then he was gone, diving away. Energy depleted, no longer a threat. She leveled off at 8,000 feet. Breathing hard, her hands trembling on the stick. The adrenaline was starting to hit now, delayed, overwhelming. Her altimeter read 7,800 feet. Fuel gauge showed half tanks. Engine temperature normal. No damaged lights. She was alive. The radio crackled. Davy's voice, tense and clipped. Red 4, where are you? Red 4, Angels 8, southwest of the merge. 3 bandits engaged, no damage. A pause. Then say again. 3 bandits engaged. They broke off. Another pause, longer this time. Then Carrington's voice cut in, low and hard. Red 4, return to base. We're done here. The flight reassembled over the coast. They counted themselves. All 8 Spitfires accounted for. 2 190s confirmed damaged, 1 probable. No losses. It should have been a disaster. It wasn't. They landed at Biggin Hill 20 minutes later. When Maggie climbed out of her cockpit, the ground crew chief stared at her like she'd grown a second head. Her Spitfire had no visible damage, not a single bullet hole. He asked what happened. She told him she got lucky. He didn't believe her. Neither did the intelligence officer who debriefed her. Neither did Davies, who sat in the back of the room and listened to her describe the engagement in flat, factual sentences that made it sound like a textbook exercise instead of a near-death experience. When she finished, the intelligence officer asked the question everyone was thinking. You deliberately slowed down with the 190 on your tail. Yes, sir. That's not standard doctrine. No, sir. Why did you do it? She looked at him, then at Davies, then at the notepad in front of her. She thought about the reports she'd read, the incidents that didn't make the official record, the pilots who survived by breaking the rules. Because standard doctrine assumes the enemy pilot is predictable. This one wasn't. He was very good. If I'd done what he expected, I'd be dead. The room was silent. Carrington called her into his office that evening. She stood at attention in front of his desk while he read through the debriefing report, his face unreadable. Outside the window, the sun was setting over the airfield, turning the dispersal areas orange and gold. Somewhere in the distance, ground crews were refueling Spitfires for the next morning's patrol. The war didn't stop. It never stopped. Carrington looked up. Sit down, Thornhill. She sat. He closed the report and leaned back in his chair, studying her with the kind of expression pilots reserved for aircraft they didn't quite trust yet. Davies says you saved his flight from a bad situation. I engaged targets that were a threat to the formation, sir. He also says you violated every energy management principle in the book. Yes, sir. And that if you'd misjudged your airspeed by 10 knots, you would have stalled and fallen out of the sky. Yes, sir. Carrington tapped his fingers on the desk, a slow rhythm that filled the silence. His damaged hand made the sound uneven, syncopated. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet. I flew against 190s in 1942. Lost a lot of good men to them. They're fast, they're tough, and the pilots who fly them know what they're doing. If you engage one and survive, you're either very lucky or very smart. If you engage 3 and come back without a scratch, you're something else entirely. He opened a drawer and pulled out a folder. Inside were pages of typewritten notes, diagrams, sketches of aircraft positions and maneuver sequences. Maggie recognized the handwriting. It was hers. The intelligence officer found these in your footlocker. Said you've been compiling unorthodox tactics from combat reports. Maneuvers that worked but weren't in the manual. Maneuvers that got people court-martialed for reckless endangerment. She said nothing. There was nothing to say. He had the evidence. Carrington closed the folder. I'm not going to reprimand you. I'm going to ask you a question instead. Do you think you can teach this? She blinked. Sir, what you did up there today. The throttle reduction, the vertical stall maneuver, the head-on reversal. Do you think you can teach other pilots to do the same thing? She thought about it. Really thought about it. The maneuver had worked because she'd understood the geometry, the energy exchange, the psychological pressure on the enemy pilot. She'd practiced it in her head 100 times, visualized the timing, the sight picture, the control inputs. But teaching someone else to execute it under fire, with their life on the line, in the chaos of combat, that was different. I think so, sir. But they'd need to understand why it works, not just how. If they try it without understanding the principle, they'll die. Carrington nodded slowly. That's what I thought you'd say. He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the airfield. Group Captain is forming a tactical development unit next month, testing new combat techniques, refining doctrine, training flight leaders on how to counter Luftwaffe tactics. They want experienced pilots who can think outside the manual. I'm recommending you. Maggie felt something shift in her chest. Not excitement, not relief. Something colder and sharper. Opportunity, maybe. Or responsibility. And if I decline, sir? Carrington turned to look at her. Then you stay here and keep flying patrols. And the next time you pull a stunt like today, you might not be so lucky. Or one of your wingmen might try to copy you and die. because they didn't have your preparation. Your choice, Thornhill. But I think you already know what the right answer is. She did. I'll accept the posting, sir. Good. You report to Wittering on April 1st. Dismissed. She stood, saluted, and turned to leave. She was almost at the door when Carrington spoke again. Thornhill. She stopped. What you did today wasn't luck. It was skill. And courage. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. She didn't trust herself to speak. She just nodded and left. The next 3 weeks passed in a blur of patrols, debriefings, and quiet preparation. Word of the engagement spread through the squadron, distorted and exaggerated with each retelling. By the second week, the story had her taking on 190 single-handedly. By the third week, she'd supposedly shot down 2 confirmed and 1 probable. None of it was true, but she didn't correct the rumors. Let them think what they wanted. She had work to do. She flew 12 more missions before the posting came through. None of them involved combat. The Luftwaffe was pulling back, conserving strength, preparing for the invasion they knew was coming. The skies over France were quieter than they'd been in months. It felt like the pause before a storm. On March 31st, she packed her kit, said goodbye to the ground crew, and caught a transport to Wittering. The tactical development unit was smaller than she expected. 8 pilots, 2 instructors, and a group captain named Hollis, who had flown Hurricanes in the Battle of Britain and looked like he'd aged 20 years in 4. He welcomed her with a handshake and a tired smile. Flight Officer Thornhill, I've read your report. Quite a piece of flying. Thank you, sir. I'm told you have theories about energy management and enemy psychology. I have observations, sir, and some ideas. Good. We need ideas. The Luftwaffe is getting better, not worse. Their pilots have experience, discipline, and excellent equipment. We're losing too many squadron leaders because they're still flying 1940 tactics against 1944 opponents. Your job is to help us fix that. He led her to a briefing room where the other pilots were waiting. They looked up as she entered, and she saw the same expression on their faces that she'd seen at Biggin Hill. Skepticism, curiosity, doubt. One of them, a flight lieutenant with a thin mustache and a chest full of ribbons, leaned back in his chair and smiled. So you're the girl who made a 190 overshoot by stalling her kite. That's one way to describe it. What's another way? She met his eyes. A calculated energy trap that exploited the enemy's expectation of predictable defensive behavior. The room went quiet. The flight lieutenant's smile faded. Hollis cleared his throat. Right then. Let's get started. For the next 4 weeks, Maggie lived in briefing rooms and cockpits. She flew mock engagements against veteran pilots who knew every trick in the book. She lost more fights than she won, but every loss taught her something. So she refined it. She tested variations. She documented the decision tree. When to use it, when to avoid it, what cues to look for, what mistakes to avoid. She taught the other pilots not just the mechanics, but the psychology. Make the enemy believe you're wounded. Make them believe you're beaten. Make them so confident that they stop thinking and start reacting. Then break the pattern. 2 pilots washed out in the first week. The maneuver required a level of precision and nerve that not everyone had. 1 pilot stalled too early and spun out of control, recovering only 500 feet above the ground. He refused to try again. Maggie didn't blame him. The margin for error was razor-thin, but the pilots who mastered it became devastating. By late April, the Tactical Development Unit had produced a classified supplement to the Standard Fighter Combat Manual. It was 8 pages long, illustrated with diagrams, written in language that assumed the reader was intelligent and willing to think. It covered energy traps, psychological deception, and non-standard maneuvers for defeating experienced opponents. Maggie wrote most of it. Hollis signed it. Group headquarters distributed it to squadron leaders across fighter command with orders to brief their pilots and incorporate the tactics into training. Most of them ignored it. The manual was doctrine. Doctrine was safe. Doctrine had been refined over years of combat and written by people who knew what they were doing. This new supplement was 8 pages of experimental nonsense, written by a girl who'd survived one engagement and thought she'd reinvented air combat. That's what the critics said. That's what the old guard believed. Until June. The invasion began on the 6th. Thousands of aircraft filled the skies over Normandy, bombers and fighters and transports, all converging on the beaches. The Luftwaffe rose to meet them, and the fighting was brutal. In the first week alone, Fighter Command lost 37 pilots, but the squadrons that had studied the tactical supplement lost fewer, and the pilots who mastered the energy trap tactics came back with kill confirmations and damage reports that made the skeptics pay attention. By the end of June, the supplement was required reading. By July, Maggie was training flight leaders at the Central Gunnery School. By August, Luftwaffe intelligence had identified a pattern in RAF fighter tactics that didn't match previous behavior. German pilots began reporting encounters with Spitfires that deliberately slowed down, that stalled in defensive situations, that turned into attacks instead of away. They called it dive fall. The trap. They issued warnings. They updated their own tactical guidance. But warnings only worked if pilots remembered them in the heat of combat, and muscle memory was hard to override. Maggie never flew combat again. She didn't need to. Her war was fought in classrooms and briefing rooms, teaching other pilots to survive, to think, to exploit the enemy's assumptions. She trained over 200 pilots before the war ended. 43 of them became aces. 16 became squadron leaders. 7 received the Distinguished Flying Cross. None of them knew her name. The tactical supplement was anonymous, written in the passive voice, attributed to tactical development research. That's how she wanted it. She didn't need credit. She needed pilots to come home. The war in Europe ended in May 1945. Maggie was promoted to flight lieutenant and assigned to the Air Historical Branch, documenting combat tactics and lessons learned. She spent 2 years interviewing pilots, compiling reports, writing analyses that would shape RAF doctrine for the next decade. She never talked about the engagement over Normandy. When other pilots mentioned it, she changed the subject. In 1947, she left the RAF and went back to civilian life. She worked as a flight instructor in Yorkshire, teaching students to fly chipmunks and tiger moths, never mentioning the Spitfires or the war or the time she'd stared down 3 FW-190s and walked away. She married a doctor in 1950, had 2 children, lived quietly in a village outside Leeds. She died in 1998, 77 years old, remembered by her family as a loving mother and a talented pilot who'd served in the war. The RAF remembered her differently. In 2003, the Ministry of Defense declassified portions of the Tactical Development Unit's records. Researchers found her notes, her diagrams, her reports. They found the original draft of the tactical supplement, handwritten, every word in her precise script. They traced the influence of those 8 pages through decades of fighter combat doctrine, from Korea to the Falklands, from Vietnam to the Gulf War. The principle was always the same. Understand your enemy's expectations, then break them. A military historian wrote a paper about her in 2007. It was titled The Invisible Ace, Flight Officer Margaret Thornhill and the Evolution of Energy Combat Tactics. It documented her contribution to air combat theory, her influence on training methodology, and the dozens of pilots who survived the war because they'd learned to think instead of react. The paper was presented at the Royal Aeronautical Society. 3 retired air marshals attended. One of them had been trained by Maggie in 1944. He was 91 years old, and when they asked him what he remembered most about her, he said this: "She taught us that the most dangerous pilot isn't the one with the fastest aircraft or the most kills. It's the one who understands the fight better than you do, the one who sees the pattern you don't know you're following." She was that pilot, and she made sure we became that pilot too. The maneuver she executed over Normandy on March 17, 1944, has a name now. Modern fighter pilots call it a velocity vector reversal or a stall fight transition. It's taught at advanced tactical courses, refined with fly-by-wire controls and thrust vectoring, executed at speeds and altitudes Maggie never could have imagined. But the principle is still hers. Slow down when they expect you to speed up. Climb when they expect you to dive. Break the pattern. Survive. She never saw herself as a revolutionary. She was just a pilot who paid attention, who read the reports, who noticed what others missed. She was a girl from a small town who loved flying and refused to accept that the manual had all the answers. She was someone they underestimated, right up until the moment she proved them wrong. And when the moment came, when 3 enemy fighters had her trapped and the manual said she was already dead, she didn't panic. "We had him," he said. "Perfect position, perfect range, perfect shot." And then he wasn't there anymore. He just stopped, and we flew past him like idiots. I thought my eyes were broken. I thought the laws of physics had changed. It was like fighting a ghost. That ghost saved lives. It changed doctrine. It proved that intelligence and timing could defeat raw power, that understanding the enemy's mind was as important as understanding your aircraft, that sometimes the bravest thing you could do was the thing everyone said was impossible. If you enjoy real World War II stories, where skill and courage change history, subscribe for more. The war taught 1,000 lessons, but perhaps the most important one was this: never underestimate the quiet ones who take notes, who study the patterns, who think 3 moves ahead. They're the ones who survive, and they're the ones who make sure others survive too. Maggie Thornhill did both.